Michael was very friendly, and he was the type of kid that you couldn't keep him still. You had to keep your eyes on him at all times. I had to be strict because there was a lot of crime in the area where we came from. And a good father to stick by the kids, make sure they got plenty to eat. I did all of that. And make sure that the talent that they have, try to help them develop it. I did all of that. And look what it got.
Do you think it might have been that Michael was more sensitive and he took it differently than the other kids? You being strict?
No, I think it's because in being strict, you were able to control. And being able to control while they was all in one place, we knew what it was at all times. I was able to rehearse them a lot. And once I started rehearsing them and kept them busy, learning different songs and dances and all that stuff, it started paying off. So I don't think being too strict, I was being too strict. No.
I don't think it was too strict at all because where we came from, Gary, Indiana, it's the murder capital of the world.
It was then. I don't know.
It still is.
It is. We didn't make no mistakes.
Joe, don't say that. You don't know.
I don't make no mistake. I was feeding them every day. They had food in their hands. And then when you have those many kids, you got to keep bread in their hands. And they ate. Really. And little kids like they ate. So it was Papa that kept food on the table for them. I did that. I did my part.
Is Michael really weird?
What do you mean by weird? Everybody wants to know if Michael's weird. One thing I'll tell you, he's not gay. Is that what you call weird?
I wasn't asking that.
Why you want to do that?
That's what he's trying to say.
No, I wasn't asking if he was gay. I wanted his parents to tell the people of Atlanta whether or not he's wacko.
Wacko, like they call him. Wacko,
right. Now that's what a lot of the press call him. I'm asking his
Wacko
parents to
Jacko.
set the record straight.
Michael is not weird, and he's not gay, and the only thing it is, he's a perfectionist. He enjoys
workaholic.
He's a workaholic.
Too
He
much.
enjoys what he's doing.
Do you think, Joe, you could have prevented all this by having, father-to-son conversation and look.
I might have could have prevent some of it by teaching them not to trust nobody. That would have been a big help, not to trust anyone. Because Michael trusts a whole lot of people. And the ones that he trusts, hey, that's a problem.
Did you think at this point it was going to try?
Yes,
No, I didn't think so.
I did.
You were pessimistic, I remember that.
I did. Because I know how wicked people are. And somebody wants to prove a point. They've used up too much of
Too
the
much what?
tax money.
You want to say tax money?
Mm-hmm. They raided Michael's ranch. And then Snedden and the other people came out in the news. They were jumping up and down. We got him. We finally got him. That was hard for me as a mother. Like my son killed somebody or something.
If instead of me on this chair was a DA Snowden, what would you tell him?
I can't say that. I can't say that on television.
Television would not allow that. What would you tell him?
Um, no, I'd rather not say anything about him.
Mm-hmm.
I think he had, I think when he raided my son's ranch and he got on television that evening, I think he showed his true colors. They don't call him Mad Dog for nothing. And he's proud of something that shouldn't be.
People have made some noise it might be about racism. What do you think?
It is racism. It is. Catherine's not going to say it, but I will say it. It is.
He built one of the greatest musical families the world has ever seen, and by the time it mattered most, almost none of them wanted him in the room. Joseph Jackson turned 5 kids from a 2-bedroom house in Gary, Indiana, into the Jackson 5, arguably the most successful family act in the history of American music. Without him, there's a real chance Michael Jackson never becomes Michael Jackson at all. And yet, when Michael died in 2009, Joseph wasn't standing beside the family at the center of the grief. He was on the outside of it, watching a legacy he helped create, being mourned by a world that had spent decades calling him the villain of the story. How does a man build something that big and end up that far from it? Joseph Jackson wasn't a musician by trade. He worked as a crane operator at a steel mill in Gary, Indiana, and played guitar on the side in a local R&B group that never quite broke through. That failure mattered more than people realize. Joseph got close enough to the music business to see what it could offer, and far enough away from actual success to understand exactly how badly he wanted it. For himself first, and later unmistakably for his children. Gary, Indiana in the 1950s and 60s wasn't a place that handed out second chances easily. It was a steel town, built around brutal shift work and a narrow set of paths out of poverty. Joseph had watched that town swallow talented people whole, men with real ability who never got the one break that separates a working musician from a forgotten one. That experience left a mark on him that shaped everything that came after. He wasn't going to leave his own sons' careers up to chance, luck, or anyone else's goodwill. If there was a system to be built around talent, he was going to build it himself, and he was going to control every piece of it. When he noticed his sons had real musical talent, he didn't treat it like a hobby, he treated it like a project. Rehearsals were mandatory, long, and unforgiving. Mistakes were not gently corrected, they were punished, often physically, in ways several of his children would later describe as genuinely brutal. Michael himself said publicly, more than once, that Joseph had beaten him as a child, and that the fear of his father was one of the defining emotional experiences of his early life. That discipline produced results almost nobody could argue with. By the time the Jackson 5 signed with Motown in 1968, they weren't just talented, they were drilled to a level of precision that separated them instantly from other child acts. Joseph had, in effect, built a machine, and his sons were both its engine and its raw material. The trade-off underneath that machine is the part of the story that gets flattened the most. Joseph gave his children a level of professional readiness most seasoned adult performers never reach. He also gave at least some of them a fear response to failure that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Both of those things are true at the same time, and neither cancels the other out. It's worth sitting with just how young the boys actually were when this discipline took hold. Michael was barely 5 years old when he started performing publicly. By the time most children are learning to read fluently, he was already rehearsing for hours after school, under the direct supervision of a father who treated every missed note as a personal failure. That's not a normal childhood by any definition, and the strange part is that it worked, at least by the only measure Joseph seemed to care about. The Jackson 5 didn't just succeed. They became one of the most explosive debut acts in the history of American music, scoring 4 consecutive #1 singles right out of the gate, a feat almost no other group has ever matched. Once Motown signed the group, Joseph didn't step back and let a label take over his sons' careers. He stayed embedded in almost every decision, negotiating contracts, managing schedules, controlling access to his children in a way few outside managers would have been allowed to. For a black family navigating the music industry in the late 1960s, that level of control wasn't paranoia. It was, in many ways, a rational response to an industry with a long history of exploiting black artists financially. Joseph had seen it happen to other performers. He wasn't going to let it happen to his kids. That instinct wasn't unfounded either. Motown itself, for all its cultural significance, ran on a business model that historically kept a tight grip on artist earnings, often leaving even hugely successful performers with a fraction of the wealth their music actually generated. Joseph's insistence on staying involved in every contract negotiation, every scheduling decision, every dollar flowing through the group's finances wasn't simply about control for its own sake, at least not entirely. It was a defensive posture, built by a man who understood, correctly, that nobody else in that room was going to protect his son's interests as fiercely as he would. That protectiveness, though, curdled into something more controlling as the group's fame grew. Joseph managed not just their business affairs, but their personal lives. Friendships, free time, even basic autonomy were tightly restricted. Michael later described a childhood with almost no normal social contact outside the family, no real friends his own age, nothing resembling an ordinary adolescence. The isolation that would define so much of his adult psychology didn't start with fame itself. It started with a father who believed control was the price of success, and never really stopped charging it. By the mid-1970s, the family's frustration with Motown's financial terms boiled over, and the Jacksons made the move to Epic Records, a decision Joseph helped drive, still functioning as the family's central authority even as his sons matured into adults with their own opinions about their careers. For a while longer, that arrangement held. It wouldn't hold forever. There was something almost inevitable about how this particular chapter had to end. A management style built entirely around control works best on children, people who don't yet have the leverage, the money, or the confidence to push back. But the Jackson boys weren't staying children. Michael in particular was rapidly becoming one of the most valuable performers on the planet, and valuable performers eventually start asking questions that obedient children don't. Why does my father control my schedule? Why does my father control my money? Why does my father get final say on decisions that only affect my life? Those questions didn't arrive all at once. They built slowly, over years, the same way most family ruptures do, not as a single dramatic break, but as a long accumulation of small moments where trust quietly eroded. As Michael's solo career exploded through Off the Wall and then Thriller, something inevitable started happening. The child who had once been the most controlled member of the family became, by a wide margin, its most powerful figure, financially, culturally, globally. And the psychological weight of decades under Joseph's authority didn't just disappear because Michael was suddenly rich and famous beyond anything his father had ever imagined for him. Michael began pulling away, deliberately and permanently. He hired his own management outside his father's orbit. He made major business and creative decisions without consulting Joseph first, and in interviews across the following decades, he spoke with increasing openness about the fear and pain that defined his childhood under Joseph's discipline, never fully reconciling, never quite closing the distance. The most symbolically loaded move came later, when Michael purchased the family's Encino property outright and restructured its ownership specifically to give his mother Catherine financial independence, a decision widely understood as a quiet, deliberate undermining of Joseph's authority as head of the household. He didn't need to say anything publicly about what that move meant. The message was already unmistakable to everyone who knew the family's history. By the time Michael was one of the most famous human beings on the planet, Joseph Jackson had gone from being the architect of his son's entire career to someone largely kept at arm's length from it. What made this particular kind of estrangement so unusual is that it wasn't rooted in betrayal or scandal, the way most public family fallouts tend to be. There was no single dramatic incident the press could point to and say, "This is where it broke." It was quieter than that, and in some ways more damning. A son who had every resource in the world to reconnect with his father, choosing again and again not to close that distance. That's not the story of a relationship destroyed by a single event. That's the story of a relationship that a son decided, deliberately, not to repair. Joseph never stopped trying to stay relevant to the empire he'd helped build. He pursued other business ventures, managing other artists, launching entertainment projects, few of which came close to matching what he'd built with his own children. There's something almost tragic in that pattern. The one act of undeniable genius in Joseph Jackson's career was recognizing and relentlessly cultivating the talent inside his own kids. Nothing he attempted afterward, without that specific raw material, ever came close to repeating it. It's a pattern that shows up again and again with people who build something extraordinary once, and then spend the rest of their lives chasing the same result, without the specific conditions that made it possible the first time. Joseph wasn't managing raw talent anymore when he moved on to other artists. He was managing people who hadn't spent a childhood under his direct authority, who had leverage he'd never had to negotiate around with his own sons, and who simply weren't going to submit to the same level of control that had defined the Jackson Five's early years. Without that control, Joseph's methods didn't translate nearly as effectively, and none of his later ventures ever approached the scale of what he'd built the first time. Public perception of Joseph, meanwhile, hardened over the years into something close to caricature. The domineering, abusive stage father, a figure blamed by much of the public for many of Michael's adult struggles with intimacy, trust, and self-image. That reputation wasn't invented from nothing. Multiple Jackson children corroborated accounts of physical abuse during their childhood, including Michael's entire narrative about who he was, based almost entirely on Michael's side of the story, without much room left for his own version of events. Whatever complicated truth actually existed between them, the public settled on a simpler one: Joseph as villain, full stop. And there was very little he could do at that point to complicate that picture, even if some of the complication was genuinely earned. When Michael Jackson died suddenly in June 2009, the world's grief was instant and overwhelming. Catherine Jackson stood at the center of the family's public mourning, deeply involved in decisions about the memorial, the estate, and how Michael would be remembered. Joseph's presence, by contrast, felt noticeably peripheral, present at public events, but never positioned as the emotional center of the family's loss, the way a father might ordinarily be expected to be. Part of that distance was structural. Michael's will, last updated years earlier, made no meaningful provision for Joseph at all, a detail that spoke louder than any public statement could have about where their relationship actually stood by the end. Joseph, for his part, continued speaking publicly about his son in the years that followed, sometimes in ways that struck observers as more focused on preserving his own relevance to the Jackson legacy than genuinely processing the loss of his child. It's worth acknowledging how easy it would be to read that pattern as pure opportunism, and how incomplete that reading probably is. Grief doesn't move in straight lines, and public figures rarely get the space to process loss privately the way ordinary people do. It's entirely possible that Joseph's public comments in those years reflected some combination of genuine grief, decades of complicated love, and an old habit of never quite knowing how to talk about his family, except through the lens of legacy and achievement, the same lens he'd used to build that family's entire career in the first place. That dynamic followed him for the rest of his life. When Joseph Jackson died in 2018, the coverage of his death inevitably circled back to the same unresolved question that had defined his public image for decades. Was he remembered as the man who built one of the greatest musical dynasties in American history, or as the man whose own children spent much of their adult lives trying to put distance between themselves and him? The honest answer is that he was both, and the culture never fully figured out how to hold those two truths at the same time. Michael's death, in a strange way, froze that unresolved question permanently. There would be no late-life reconciliation between them, no interview years later where father and son finally addressed everything openly, the way estranged families sometimes eventually do when enough time has passed. The distance that existed at the moment Michael died is, functionally, the final